The morning air on Long Island carried the scent of salt and money, a combination Isabella had grown accustomed to during her 3 years working at the Romano estate. She arrived at 7:30, as she always did, her small sedan looking pitiful against the backdrop of luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway. The mansion loomed before her, all white stone and tall windows that reflected the early sun like a fortress made of light. She pulled her coat tighter around her body, wincing as the fabric brushed against the bruises on her left arm, still tender from 2 nights ago, when Marcus had grabbed her during another one of their arguments that wasn't really an argument, but rather him yelling while she tried to make herself smaller. She had told herself it was over, had told him it was over. But Marcus didn't accept endings he hadn't authored himself, and so he kept showing up, kept demanding, kept reminding her that she had once loved him, and therefore owed him something she could never quite define. The bruises were his latest counter-argument, purple and yellow fingerprints that spelled out possession in a language she was trying desperately to forget how to read. Isabella had covered them with makeup that morning, then decided the coat was safer, even though the June weather made it ridiculous. Better to look odd than to invite questions she had no intention of answering. The side entrance to the mansion was already unlocked, which meant Rosa, the head housekeeper, had arrived before her. Isabella slipped inside, grateful for the cool darkness of the service hallway, and made her way to the kitchen where she would begin her day the same way she always did by preparing the morning coffee service for Mr. Romano, who took his espresso at exactly 8 o'clock and his cappuccino at 9, both made with the imported beans he had shipped from a specific roaster in Naples. She had learned his preferences through observation rather than instruction, because Matteo Romano was not a man who explained himself to anyone, least of all the staff who maintained the elegant machinery of his life. She had seen him perhaps a dozen times in total, always from a distance, always in passing. He was the kind of presence that filled a room even when he was silent, standing well over 6 feet, with the build of someone who understood that physical power was just another form of currency. His hair was always perfectly styled, swept back from his face in that effortlessly Italian way that probably required more effort than it appeared, and he wore suits that cost more than her annual salary, custom-tailored to accommodate shoulders that seemed designed to carry the weight of an empire. She had noticed, during one of those brief encounters, that he wore a watch that caught the light in a way that suggested complications beyond simple timekeeping, and a thin gold chain at his neck that disappeared beneath his collar, and that he always left at least one button of his shirt undone, as if even in his formality he refused to be completely contained. Isabella had never spoken to him directly. Rosa handled all communication with Mr. Romano, translating his needs into tasks that were then distributed among the staff. Isabella's role was simple. She cleaned the guest quarters, maintained the library, and assisted in the kitchen when needed. She was meant to be invisible, a shadow that kept the mansion functioning without leaving fingerprints on the glass or questions in the air. She was good at being invisible. She had been practicing for years, first with her father, who preferred daughters who didn't speak unless spoken to, then with Marcus, who preferred girlfriends who didn't have opinions that contradicted his own. Invisibility was safety, or so she had convinced herself, right up until the moment she walked into the kitchen that morning and found Matteo Romano standing at the counter, waiting for his espresso that hadn't yet been made, because she was 3 minutes later than usual. He looked up when she entered, and Isabella felt her breath catch in her throat. Not from attraction, though. He was objectively beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are, but from the sudden awareness that she had failed in some small but significant way. His eyes were dark, almost black in the early morning light, and they moved from her face to her coat to her hands, which were clutching the fabric closed with more force than necessary. She saw him notice, saw the slight narrowing of his gaze, the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, which somehow felt worse than if he had reprimanded her for her lateness. "Mi scusi, Mr. Romano," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I'll have your espresso ready in just a moment." He didn't respond, didn't move, just continued to look at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Isabella turned to the espresso machine, her hands shaking slightly as she ground the beans and tamped the grounds with a precision born of repetition rather than calm. She could feel him watching her, could sense the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against her back. The machine hissed and gurgled, and she focused on that sound, on the familiar ritual of extraction and temperature and timing. Anything to avoid acknowledging the man who stood less than 10 feet away, radiating a silence that felt like evaluation. When the espresso was ready, she placed it on a small tray with a glass of sparkling water and a single biscotto, exactly as he preferred, and turned to hand it to him. But he hadn't moved to the breakfast table as he usually did. He was still standing at the counter, still watching her, and now she had no choice but to approach him, to cross that space and enter his immediate orbit in a way that felt dangerous for reasons she couldn't articulate. She set the tray down in front of him, careful not to meet his eyes, and started to step back, to retreat to the safety of invisibility. "Your arm," he said, and his voice was low, accented, the kind of voice that made simple words sound like declarations. "What happened to your arm?" Isabella froze, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. She hadn't realized the coat had slipped when she was working the espresso machine, revealing a strip of bruised skin just above her wrist. She quickly adjusted the fabric, covering the evidence, and forced herself to smile. The same smile she had perfected for Marcus when he asked if she was angry after making her cry. "Nothing, Mr. Romano. I just bumped into a door. Clumsy." He didn't believe her. She could see it in the way his expression didn't change, in the way he continued to stare at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see through the lie and into the truth she was trying so hard to bury. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and Isabella had the strangest sensation that she was being weighed, measured, evaluated, according to criteria she didn't understand. Then Matteo picked up his espresso, took a slow sip, and set the cup down with a precision that felt deliberate. "Doors don't leave fingerprints," he said quietly, and then he walked past her, out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there with her heart racing and her hands still clutching her coat closed, wondering what exactly had just happened and why it felt like everything had changed in the space of a conversation that had barely qualified as one. She heard his footsteps fade down the hallway, heard the distant sound of a door closing, and only then did she allow herself to breathe, to let go of the coat, to look down at her arm, where the bruises spelled out a truth that a man she barely knew had read in less than a minute. Isabella told herself it didn't matter, told herself that Mr. Romano was simply observant, that it was nothing, that tomorrow everything would return to normal. But even as she cleaned up the kitchen and began her other duties, moving through the mansion with her usual quiet efficiency, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that she had become visible in a way that terrified her more than Marcus's anger ever had. Because Marcus's violence was at least predictable, comprehensible, something she could manage by making herself smaller. Matteo Romano's attention felt like something else entirely, something that didn't ask for permission or offer explanations, something that simply was, like gravity or consequence. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze of normalcy and tension. Isabella completed her tasks with mechanical precision, cleaning the guest quarters that no guests currently occupied, dusting the library shelves that held books in Italian and English, and what looked like Latin, arranging fresh flowers in the vases throughout the mansion's public spaces. She saw Mr. Romano once more, briefly, when he passed through the main hall while she was adjusting the hydrangeas in a ceramic vase near the staircase. He didn't speak to her, didn't even acknowledge her presence, and yet she felt his awareness of her, like heat from a fire she couldn't see. It made her nervous in a way that was different from the nervousness Marcus inspired. Marcus made her afraid of what he might do. Matteo Romano made her afraid of what she might allow. By 3 o'clock, her shift was technically over, but Isabella lingered, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, finding small tasks to justify her continued presence, because going home meant the possibility that Marcus would be waiting outside her apartment again, leaning against his car with that smile that used to make her feel chosen, and now just made her feel trapped. She was wiping down the kitchen counters for the second time when Rosa found her. The older woman's face creased with the kind of knowing concern that made Isabella want to run. "Child?" Rosa said in her accented English, softer than usual. "Why are you still here? Your day is done." "Just finishing up," Isabella replied, keeping her eyes on the counter, on the circular motions of the cloth against granite that was already spotless. Rosa was quiet for a moment, and Isabella could feel her watching, assessing, preparing to say something that Isabella didn't want to hear. "Mr. Romano, he asked about you today. Asked how long you've worked here, if you are reliable, if you have family nearby." Isabella's hand stilled. Why would he ask that? "I don't question Mr. Romano's questions," Rosa said carefully, "but I answer them honestly. I told him you are the best worker I have, that you come every day, on time, never complain, that you live alone." She paused, then added with deliberate gentleness, "that sometimes you come to work looking like you've had a difficult night." Heat flooded Isabella's face, shame and anger mixing into something that made her throat tight. "Rosa, I don't need you to explain, Bambina. I need you to be careful." Rosa stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Mr. Romano is not a bad man, but he is not a safe man either. When he takes interest in something, he doesn't let it go. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Isabella nodded, though she wasn't sure she did understand, wasn't sure she wanted to. She finished wiping the counter and hung the cloth over the sink's edge, then retrieved her purse from the staff room and headed for the exit, aware of Rosa's eyes following her the entire way. The summer evening was still bright, the sun not yet ready to concede to darkness, and Isabella walked to her car with her keys already in her hand, a habit she had developed after one too many surprise encounters with Marcus in parking lots and stairwells and places he had no business being. Her apartment was in a modest complex 20 minutes away, the kind of place where young professionals lived before they could afford something better. All beige walls and functional appliances and neighbors you recognized but didn't really know. She parked in her assigned spot and was almost to her building's entrance when she saw him. Marcus was sitting on the low wall near the entrance, his posture casual, as if he had every right to be there, as if her repeated requests that he leave her alone were suggestions rather than boundaries. "Izzy," he called out, standing as she approached, and she hated how her body responded to his voice, not with affection, but with that animal awareness of threat that made her muscles tense and her heart rate spike. "We need to talk." "No, Marcus, we don't." She kept walking, keys gripped between her fingers the way the self-defense article had suggested, though she couldn't imagine actually using them, couldn't imagine escalating his anger into something worse than it already was. He moved quickly, intercepting her path, standing between her and the door with that expression he got when he was trying to seem reasonable while actually being anything but. "You can't just cut me out of your life like this. We were together for 2 years. That means something." "It means we had 2 years. Past tense. It's over, Marcus. You don't get to decide that alone." "Actually," Isabella said, her voice shaking but determined, "I do. That's exactly how breakups work." His face changed then, the mask of reasonableness slipping to reveal the anger beneath, and she saw his hand move, saw him reach for her arm, the same arm he had grabbed 2 nights ago, and she flinched back, hard, her keys falling from her hand and clattering on the concrete. They both looked at the keys, then at each other, and in that moment, Isabella saw something in his eyes that made her understand that this wasn't going to end with a conversation, wasn't going to end with him accepting her decision and walking away like a reasonable person. This was going to end badly, one way or another, and she was alone and tired, and so desperately tired of being afraid. But then another voice cut through the evening air, calm and cold, and carrying the weight of absolute authority. "She asked you to leave." Both Isabella and Marcus turned to see Matteo Romano standing near the parking lot entrance, dressed in dark slacks and a white shirt, with the collar open and sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing scattered dark ink that decorated his skin in patterns Isabella couldn't quite make out from this distance, but that somehow made him look more dangerous rather than less. He walked toward them with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to rush, because obstacles simply moved out of his way, and Isabella felt the air change, felt the dynamic shift in a way that made her breath catch. Marcus, to his credit, or perhaps his stupidity, didn't back down immediately. "This is a private conversation, man. Move along." Matteo stopped about 10 feet away, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression neutral in a way that somehow communicated more threat than any aggressive posture could have. "I don't think you understand the situation. Let me make it clear. You're going to walk away now, and you're not going to come back. You're not going to call. You're not going to text. You're going to forget this address, forget her name, forget she exists. And if you're very smart, you'll do this without needing further convincing." "Who the fuck are you?" Marcus demanded, puffing up in that way men do when they're trying to seem bigger than they are. "I'm the person explaining your options." Matteo's voice didn't rise, didn't change inflection, remained perfectly level, and somehow all the more terrifying for it. "You can walk away now, under your own power, with your pride intact if not your dignity. Or I can make you leave, and you'll do it on a stretcher while trying to explain to the paramedics why you thought it was a good idea to harass a woman who made it clear she doesn't want your attention. Your choice. You have 10 seconds to make it." Isabella stood frozen, watching this unfold as if it were happening to someone else, as if she were observing from a great distance rather than standing in the center of a confrontation she hadn't asked for and didn't know how to navigate. Marcus looked at her, then at Matteo, then back at her, and she saw the calculation happening behind his eyes, the weighing of his pride against his self-preservation instinct. For a moment, she thought he might actually be stupid enough to challenge this man who radiated danger the way other people radiated warmth, but then survival won out over ego. "This isn't over, Isabella," Marcus said, but he was already backing away, already retreating toward his car with the stiff-legged walk of someone trying not to run. "Yes," Matteo said quietly. "It is." They watched Marcus get in his car and drive away, his tires squealing slightly in a final gesture of impotent anger. And then they were alone. Isabella and her employer, standing in the parking lot of her apartment complex, as the sun finally began its descent toward the horizon. She should say something, she knew. Should thank him. Should explain. Should do something other than stand there staring at this man who had just inserted himself into her personal life in the most dramatic way possible. "Thank you," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Matteo looked at her for a long moment, and she found herself unable to meet his eyes, unable to hold that gaze that seemed to see too much. "Pick up your keys," he said. And she did, bending to retrieve them from where they had fallen, her hands shaking as she straightened. "Go inside. Lock your door. If he comes back, you call this number." He held out a business card, plain white with a phone number printed in black ink and nothing else. Isabella took the card, her fingers brushing his for just a moment, and felt something electric pass between them that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the dangerous kind of awareness that preceded very bad decisions. "I don't want to be a burden, Mr. Romano. This isn't your problem." "I've decided it is," he said simply, as if that settled the matter, as if his decision was the only one that mattered, and perhaps in his world, it was. "Go inside, Isabella." She went, because what else could she do? Because he had used her name and somehow that made it impossible to argue. And she walked into her building and up the stairs to her second-floor apartment and locked the door behind her just as he had instructed. Only when she was inside, when the locks were engaged and she was alone, did she allow herself to process what had just happened. did she let herself feel the strange mixture of relief and terror that came from being rescued by someone who might be more dangerous than the threat he had dispatched. Isabella looked at the business card in her hand, at the number that promised protection, or perhaps just a different kind of danger, and knew with absolute certainty that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet comprehend, but would very soon be forced to understand. Sleep was elusive that night, slipping away every time Isabella closed her eyes, leaving her staring at the ceiling and replaying the parking lot confrontation until it felt more like a dream than something that had actually happened. She kept seeing Mateo's face, that perfect calm that had transformed Marcus's aggression into irrelevance, the way he had spoken as if his words were physics rather than suggestions. Around 3 a.m, she finally gave up on rest and made coffee, sitting at her small kitchen table and watching the darkness outside her window gradually lighten into dawn. The business card sat next to her mug, the numbers black against white, a hotline to something she couldn't name. She should throw it away, she thought. Should pretend yesterday's encounter hadn't happened. Should show up at the mansion and resume her invisible existence as if nothing had changed. But she knew with a certainty that sat heavy in her chest that invisibility was no longer an option. That Matteo Romano had seen her in a way that couldn't be unseen, and that whatever consequences were coming, they were already in motion. She arrived at the mansion at 7:30, exactly on time, and found the gates already open, as if they had been expecting her. The morning was overcast, clouds hanging low and gray, and the mansion looked different somehow, less like a fortress of light and more like something out of a Gothic novel, all shadows and implications. Isabella parked in her usual spot and walked to the side entrance, her stomach tight with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. Rosa was in the kitchen, but she looked different too, her usual warmth replaced with something cautious, almost formal. "Mr. Romano wants to see you," she said without preamble. "In the library. Now." Isabella's mouth went dry. "Did I do something wrong?" "I don't know, child. But when Mr. Romano asks for you specifically, you don't make him wait." The library was on the 2nd floor, a room Isabella had cleaned many times, but never when anyone was occupying it. She climbed the stairs with legs that felt unsteady and knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, which swung open before her. Knuckles had finished their 2nd wrap. Matteo stood by one of the tall windows, backlit by gray morning light, and he didn't turn when she entered, just continued looking out at the grounds as if something in the manicured landscape required his complete attention. "Close the door," he said. And she did, the click of the latch sounding too loud in the quiet space. Isabella stood just inside the room, uncertain whether she should speak, or wait, or explain, or apologize, her hands clasped in front of her like a child called before the principal. The silence stretched, long enough that she started to wonder if he had forgotten he had summoned her. And then he turned, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch, because it wasn't anger or disappointment, or anything she had been expecting. It was something darker, more intense, something that looked almost like fury, but directed at someone who wasn't her. "Tell me his name," Matteo said, his voice quiet and terribly controlled. "The man from last night. Tell me his full name." "Why?" The question escaped before she could stop it, before she could remember that you didn't question men like Matteo Romano. You simply did as they asked and hoped they were merciful. He moved toward her then, crossing the space between them with that predatory grace she had noticed before, and stopped close enough that she could see the details of the tattoo that wound up his neck, partially visible above his collar, some kind of intricate pattern that might have been religious or might have been something else entirely. He had left 2 buttons undone today, and she could see more ink beneath, dark lines against skin, and the gold chain, and the hint of muscle that suggested hours in a gym or perhaps years of a more violent kind of exercise. "Because," he said, each word precise and weighted, "I want to make sure he understands that you are under my protection now. I want to make sure that if he's stupid enough to ignore last night's warning, he knows exactly what the consequences will be. So, I'll ask again, Isabella. What is his name? She should refuse. Should tell him this was unnecessary, that Marcus would stay away now, that she could handle her own problems. But standing there, looking up at this man who radiated lethal intent wrapped in perfect tailoring, she found herself telling him the truth. Marcus Vega. He works at a law firm downtown, Richardson and Hale. Mateo nodded slowly, as if committing this information to memory, filing it away for future reference. Did he hit you before? Before the bruises you came to work with? Isabella wanted to lie, wanted to protect Marcus from whatever Mateo was planning, wanted to minimize the violence Marcus had dealt her because that's what she had always done. Made his anger smaller so it would hurt less. Made herself responsible for his loss of control so she could believe she had the power to prevent it. But something in Mateo's gaze made lying impossible, made her feel like he would know, like he would see through whatever careful fiction she tried to construct. Yes, she whispered. Not often. Just when he was stressed or I said something wrong or he had been drinking. It wasn't like it sounds. He wasn't a monster. He just had a temper. Tell me, Mateo said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming something that felt like dark water closing over her head. Do you believe that men who love women put their hands on them in anger? Do you believe that your words or your actions or his stress level justified him hurting you? Isabella stopped, because the answer was no. Of course the answer was no. But saying it out loud meant admitting that she had accepted something unacceptable, had made excuses for someone who didn't deserve her protection. No. Then stop making excuses for him. It wasn't said unkindly, but it was absolute, a statement of fact rather than opinion. Stop pretending his violence was your fault. Stop carrying his shame as if it belongs to you. Tears burned in Isabella's eyes, unexpected and unwanted. And she blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this man who had already seen too much, who had already witnessed her weakness and her poor judgment and her inability to protect herself from someone who should have been safe. I don't need you to fix this, Mr. Romano. I don't need you to protect me. I can handle Marcus. The bruises on your arm suggest otherwise. He reached out then, slowly, giving her time to pull away, and pushed up the sleeve of her shirt to reveal the fading marks Marcus had left 2 nights ago. His fingers were careful, not touching the bruised skin but tracing the air just above it, and Isabella felt heat radiating from that almost touch. Felt her body respond in ways that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with a hunger she had been pretending didn't exist. These marks tell me that you've been handling Marcus by allowing him to hurt you. That's not handling anything. That's surviving. And you deserve better than survival. You don't know what I deserve, she said, her voice breaking slightly. You don't know anything about me. I know you arrive at work early every day. I know you take pride in doing your job well. I know you tried to hide your pain because you didn't want to burden anyone with your problems. I know Marcus is a coward who found someone kind and mistook it for weakness. He released her sleeve, but his hand lingered near hers, close enough to touch, but not quite touching. And I know that if he comes near you again, if he calls you or texts you, or so much as thinks your name too loudly, I will make sure he regrets every moment of his miserable existence. Not because you need me to, but because I've decided you're mine to protect now, and I keep what's mine safe. The words should have frightened her, should have sent her running from this man who spoke of protection and possession in the same breath, who looked at her like she was something valuable that he had decided to claim. But instead, Isabella felt something else, something dangerous and electric and entirely inappropriate for the situation, for their respective positions, for the power imbalance that made any attraction between them deeply problematic. I'm not yours, Mr. Romano, she said, but the words came out weaker than she intended, more like a question than a statement. He smiled then, a small curve of his mouth that didn't quite reach his eyes, and it was the most terrifying expression she'd ever seen, because it promised things she shouldn't want and couldn't refuse. "Not yet," he agreed. "But you will be. Because I've decided it. And when I decide something, Isabella, it becomes reality. That's how my world works. You can fight it. You can tell yourself you don't want it. But we both know the truth." "What truth?" she whispered, even though she knew, even though she could feel it in the way her body responded to his proximity, in the way her pulse jumped when he said her name. "That you're tired of being invisible, that you want someone to see you, that you walked into my kitchen yesterday morning and something changed for both of us, and you felt it just as much as I did." He stepped back then, putting space between them, and the loss of his proximity felt like cold water. "Go home, Isabella. Take the day off. Tomorrow, we'll discuss your new position in this household." "New position?" She couldn't keep up with the conversation, with the way he moved from threats to attraction to employment, as if they were all connected, all part of the same incomprehensible logic. "I've decided you'll work directly for me. Personal assistant, better pay, better hours, and most importantly, you'll be where I can see you, where I can ensure that no one hurts you again. Rosa will train you in what you need to know. I didn't apply for that position. I don't want—" "What you want," he interrupted gently, "is to be safe. What you want is to stop looking over your shoulder. What you want is for someone to see the person you actually are, rather than the invisible shadow you pretend to be. I'm offering you all of that. The question is whether you're brave enough to take it." Isabella stared at him, at this man who had inserted himself into her life with the force of a natural disaster, who spoke of protection and possession with equal intensity, who looked at her like she was the answer to a question he hadn't asked but needed to solve. She should refuse. Should walk out of this library and this mansion and never come back. Should find another job where her employer didn't make her feel like the world was tilting on its axis every time he spoke. But she didn't refuse. Didn't walk away. Because standing there in the library, with the gray morning light filtering through tall windows and Matteo Romano looking at her with those dark, knowing eyes, Isabella realized that she was tired. Tired of being invisible. Tired of being afraid. Tired of pretending that she didn't want exactly what he was offering, even if accepting it meant stepping into a danger that made Marcus's violence look like a child's tantrum by comparison. "Okay," she heard herself say, the word falling into the space between them like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples she couldn't see but could feel spreading outward, changing everything. "I'll take the position." Matteo's smile widened, just slightly, just enough to make her realize that she had never really had a choice, that this conversation had been a formality rather than a negotiation, that he had decided her future the moment he saw the bruises on her arm, and she was only now catching up to a reality he had already constructed. "Good. Go home. Rest. And Isabella?" He waited until she met his eyes. "Throw away his number. Block him from your phone. If he contacts you anyway, you call me immediately. You don't try to handle it yourself. You don't make excuses. You call me, and I handle it. Understood?" She nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to leave, to escape the intensity of his presence before she did something stupid like cry or laugh or ask him what exactly he meant by protection and possession and mine. But before she reached the door, his voice stopped her one more time. "Isabella, that ex-boyfriend of yours, Marcus, consider him handled." She turned back, but he was already facing the window again. His posture relaxed. His attention apparently returned to the grounds outside, and she stood there for a moment, trying to decode what he had just said. what he meant by handled, but his profile gave nothing away. So she left, walking out of the library and down the stairs and out of the mansion into the gray morning, and drove home with her hands shaking on the steering wheel and her mind racing with questions she was afraid to answer. That night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling again, Isabella checked her phone compulsively, expecting messages from Marcus, expecting the usual pattern of angry texts, followed by apologies, followed by manipulative guilt. But there was nothing. Radio silence. Complete absence where there had always been persistence. And something about that silence made her more nervous than his anger ever had. Made her wonder what Matteo had meant by handled. Made her think about the news story she had heard on the radio that morning about a man found injured on a back road north of the city, beaten severely, but alive, unable to identify his attackers. Marcus Vega worked for Richardson and Hale downtown. Marcus Vega drove a silver sedan. Marcus Vega had light brown hair and was approximately 5'10", and would match the vague description the news report had given of the victim, who was currently in stable condition at Northern County Hospital. Isabella told herself it was a coincidence, told herself that Matteo Romano, despite his dangerous reputation and his obvious connections to something criminal, wouldn't actually hurt someone over her, wouldn't actually take handled to mean violence, wouldn't actually consider her worth that kind of trouble. But even as she tried to convince herself, she knew she was lying. Knew that the man who had looked at her that morning with those dark eyes and spoken of protection and possession was exactly the kind of man who would handle a problem permanently and without remorse. The question wasn't whether Matteo had been responsible for Marcus's sudden hospitalization. The question was why that knowledge didn't horrify her as much as it should, why some dark part of her felt satisfied by the idea that someone had finally made Marcus pay for the bruises he had left, for the fear he had instilled, for the way he had made her smaller and smaller, until she had almost forgotten what it felt like to take up space in the world. Isabella fell asleep finally, as dawn was breaking, and dreamed of dark eyes and gold chains, and the sensation of being seen so completely that invisibility was no longer an option, for better or worse, forever and always. Amen. The phone call came at noon the next day, while Isabella was sitting in her apartment trying to decide whether to show up at the mansion as Matteo had instructed, or to run as far and as fast as her modest savings would allow. The number was blocked, but she answered anyway, her voice hesitant. "Hello? Miss Isabella Torres?" The voice was female, professional, unfamiliar. "Yes? This is Sarah Chen from Richardson and Hale. I'm calling regarding Marcus Vega. I understand you were in a previous relationship with him?" Isabella's stomach dropped. "Is he okay?" There was a pause, the kind that implied the person on the other end was choosing their words carefully. "Mr. Vega was involved in an incident last night. He's currently hospitalized with significant injuries. He's stable, but he's asked that we inform you that he won't be able to contact you going forward, and he's requested that you not attempt to contact him either. He wanted me to convey his apologies for any previous misunderstandings, and his hope that you'll respect his wishes for no further communication." Isabella sat down hard on her couch, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "Did he say why? Did he say what happened?" Another careful pause. "Mr. Vega has indicated that the incident was related to a personal matter he's chosen to resolve by removing himself from certain situations. He was quite emphatic about wanting you to know that he takes full responsibility for his past behavior, and that he won't be bothering you again." The phrasing was strange, too formal, as if Sarah Chen was reading from a script someone else had written, someone who wanted to make very sure that Isabella understood the subtext beneath the professional language. "I see," Isabella managed. "Thank you for calling." "Of course. Mr. Vega also wanted me to mention that he's exploring new career opportunities in California and plans to relocate as soon as he's medically cleared to do so. He wishes you well and hopes you'll consider this matter closed." The line went dead, and Isabella sat staring at her phone, processing the information she had just received. Marcus was in the hospital. Marcus was apologizing. Marcus was moving to California. Marcus, who had never apologized for anything in the 2 years she had known him, who had never taken responsibility for his anger or his fists or his need to control everything around him, had suddenly become a model of contrition and consequence acceptance because someone had made him, because Matteo Romano had decided that handled meant putting Marcus in a hospital bed and making it very clear that any future contact with Isabella would result in consequences that made the current hospitalization look merciful by comparison. Because the man Isabella worked for, the man who had offered her a new position and spoken of protection and possession, was apparently the kind of person who could orchestrate violence and relocation with a single phone call, who could make problems disappear so thoroughly that they fled to the opposite coast just to escape his reach. Isabella should have been horrified, should have been dialing the police, reporting what she suspected, putting distance between herself and the man who had just demonstrated exactly how dangerous he was. But instead, she found herself getting dressed in professional clothes, applying makeup with steady hands, driving to the Romano estate with a calm that felt dissociative, as if she were watching herself make these decisions from a great distance. The gates opened automatically when she pulled up, and she parked in her usual spot, then walked to the front entrance instead of the side door, because everything had changed now, and using the staff entrance felt like pretending otherwise. Rosa met her in the foyer, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Romano is expecting you in his office. 3rd floor, end of the hall. You can't miss it." Isabella climbed the stairs, aware that each step was taking her deeper into something she didn't fully understand. Something that might save her or destroy her, or possibly both simultaneously. The 3rd floor was quieter than the rest of the mansion, the hallway carpeted in deep burgundy, the walls lined with art that looked expensive and vaguely menacing. The office door was ajar, and she knocked once before pushing it open. Matteo sat behind a massive desk, his shirt white and crisp, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos she had noticed before, intricate patterns that wound around his forearms and disappeared beneath the fabric. He looked up when she entered, and his expression was neutral, professional, giving nothing away. "Close the door," he said. And she did, the click of the latch sounding final. "Did you receive a phone call this morning?" "Yes." Isabella stayed near the door, maintaining distance, trying to hold on to some sense of control even though she knew it was illusory. "Marcus is in the hospital. He's moving to California. He wanted me to know he won't be contacting me again." "Good." Matteo stood, walking around the desk to lean against its front edge, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. "Then that matter is resolved, and we can focus on your new responsibilities." "What did you do to him?" The question came out harder than she intended, edged with an anger she hadn't known she was feeling. "I had a conversation with him, explained the situation in terms he could understand, made it clear that his continued presence in your life was unacceptable, and that he should consider alternative geographic locations for his future endeavors." Matteo's voice was calm, matter of fact, as if they were discussing weather rather than violence. He was resistant at first, but ultimately he saw reason. "You put him in the hospital." I ensured he understood the severity of his mistake. The hospital was merely a consequence of his slow learning process. Matteo pushed off from the desk and walked toward her, closing the distance she had tried to maintain. "Tell me, Isabella, are you upset because I hurt him, or because I took your problem and solved it without asking your permission first?" She wanted to say both, wanted to claim moral high ground, wanted to be the kind of person who objected to violence on principle, regardless of who it was directed at or why. But standing there, looking up at Matteo Romano with his dark eyes and his expensive watch, and his casual admission of orchestrated brutality, Isabella found she couldn't lie to him, or to herself. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I should be horrified. I should be calling the police. I should be running from you as fast as I can." "But you're not." "No, I'm not." He reached out and touched her face then, his fingers gentle against her cheek, and Isabella felt her breath stop at the intimacy of the gesture, at the way his touch made her skin feel electric. "Do you know why you're not running? Because somewhere inside, you understand that I'm the only thing standing between you and every person who would hurt you. Because you recognize that the world is not kind to women who are soft, and men like Marcus exist everywhere, waiting to find someone gentle enough to break. Because I saw you, really saw you, and decided you were worth protecting even if the protection required methods you find uncomfortable." "That's not protection," Isabella whispered. "That's possession." "Yes," he agreed simply, without apology or shame. "It is. Because in my world, the things I value become mine, and what's mine, I keep safe. You can call it whatever you want, Isabella, but the result is the same. Marcus is gone. The bruises on your arm will fade, and you'll never have to hide in a coat again because you're afraid someone will see the evidence of another man's violence. Tell me that's not worth the price." She wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the price was her autonomy, her agency, her right to make her own choices about her own life. But Matteo was still touching her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and she was leaning into that touch despite herself, despite knowing better, despite everything that said this was dangerous and wrong, and the beginning of something that would consume her entirely. "What exactly do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Everything," he said, as if it were obvious, as if he hadn't just admitted to wanting complete control over her existence. "Your time, your attention, your trust. Eventually, if I'm patient and you're willing, more than that. But for now, I want you to work for me, to be close enough that I can ensure no one hurts you again, to get used to the idea that you don't have to be invisible anymore because someone is finally paying attention. And if I say no?" His smile was small, knowing, dangerous. "You won't, because you're already here, already standing in my office instead of running, already leaning into my touch instead of pulling away. Because some part of you has been waiting your whole life for someone to see you completely and decide you were worth this kind of intensity. Because I'm offering you what every person secretly wants, Isabella. Someone who will burn the world down to keep you safe, even if it means becoming the monster in your story." He was right, and she hated that he was right. Hated that standing there in his office with his hand on her face and his dark eyes looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered. She felt more alive than she had in years. Felt seen in a way that was terrifying and exhilarating and completely overwhelming. "I'll work for you," she said, the words feeling like surrender and liberation simultaneously. "But I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise that if I ask you to stop, if I tell you this is too much, that I need space, you'll respect that. Promise that protection doesn't mean prison." Matteo considered this for a long moment, his expression thoughtful, and Isabella had the sense that she had surprised him, that perhaps he had expected complete capitulation rather than negotiation. Finally, he nodded. "I promise that if you ask me for space, I'll give it to you. But I also promise that I'll be waiting when you come back. Because you will come back, Isabella. Once someone sees you the way I do, invisibility stops being an option." It wasn't the promise she had asked for. Not exactly. But it was close enough, and Isabella found herself nodding, accepting terms she didn't fully understand, for a position that was clearly about much more than professional assistance. Matteo let his hand fall from her face, and the loss of contact felt like cold water, making her realize how much she had been leaning into his touch, how much she had wanted him to keep holding her. "Rosa has prepared materials for you to review. Your salary will be triple what you were making as housekeeping staff. You'll have an office on this floor next to mine. Your hours will be 8 to 5, Monday through Friday, with the understanding that sometimes I'll need you outside those hours for events or travel. You'll have access to a company car and a corporate card for expenses. Any questions? Isabella's mind was reeling with the sudden shift from intensity to logistics, from emotional warfare to employment details. What exactly will I be doing? Managing my schedule, handling correspondence, organizing my personal and professional obligations, accompanying me to social functions when necessary, being available when I need you. He paused, then added with a slight smile, and reminding me to eat lunch because I frequently forget when I'm working. It sounded almost normal, almost like a real job with real responsibilities, rather than what she suspected it actually was, which was Matteo ensuring she was close enough to control, visible enough to protect, present enough to eventually claim completely. But Isabella found she didn't care about the subtext, about the ulterior motives, about the fact that accepting this position meant accepting everything that came with it. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being afraid, tired of making herself smaller so that other people could feel bigger. And if the price of being seen was becoming part of Matteo Romano's carefully controlled world, if the cost of safety was surrendering the autonomy she had never really had anyway, then maybe that was a price worth paying. "When do I start?" she asked. "Now," he said, and handed her a tablet that had been sitting on his desk. "Start by reading through my calendar for the next month. We have a charity gala next Friday that you'll attend with me. You'll need an appropriate dress. There's a boutique in the city that I have an account with. Rosa will take you this afternoon." Isabella took the tablet, her fingers brushing his, and felt that electric current again. That awareness that every interaction with this man was charged with implications she was only beginning to understand. "A gala? I've never been to anything like that." "You'll learn. I'll teach you." He said it with such confidence, such certainty, that she would be exactly what he needed her to be. And Isabella felt something inside her shift, something that had been holding itself rigid, finally relaxing into the inevitability of this situation. She spent the rest of the afternoon learning Matteo's schedule, his preferences, his habits, absorbing information about a man who was simultaneously her employer and her protector, and potentially something much more dangerous than either. She learned that he took meetings with people whose names she recognized from news reports about organized crime, that he owned legitimate businesses and illegitimate ones, that his world existed in a gray area where law and loyalty were negotiable concepts and violence was a tool rather than a last resort, and she learned that working for Matteo Romano meant existing in that gray area with him, meant accepting that the man who had protected her from Marcus's violence was capable of much worse, meant understanding that safety came with strings attached, and those strings were woven from obsession and possession, and a kind of intensity that would either destroy her or transform her into someone she barely recognized. But as she sat in her new office, reviewing the calendar on the tablet he had given her, planning her trip to the boutique with Rosa, Isabella found she was okay with that. Found she was tired of being the person who got hurt, who stayed invisible, who made herself small for other people's comfort. Maybe it was time to be someone different, someone who took up space, someone who was worth the kind of dangerous attention Matteo Romano brought to everything he decided was his. Maybe it was time to stop running from the monster in her story and start standing beside him instead. The week that followed was a study in adaptation and subtle transformation. Isabella arrived at the mansion each morning at 8, was greeted by Rosa with coffee that appeared at her desk without her asking, and spent her days learning the intricate machinery of Matteo's life. She answered calls from men with rough voices and careful words, scheduled meetings that weren't listed in any official capacity, arranged deliveries that came in unmarked vehicles at odd hours. She learned to ask no questions, to maintain perfect discretion, to understand that her value lay not in her opinions, but in her reliability. Matteo was a demanding employer, but not an unreasonable one. He expected perfection, but acknowledged good work with a nod or a quiet, "well done," that somehow meant more than effusive praise would have. He worked long hours, often staying in his office until well past midnight, and Isabella found herself staying late as well, not because he asked her to, but because leaving felt like abandoning a post she hadn't realized she was guarding. They didn't speak about Marcus again, didn't discuss the violence that had sent him to the hospital, or the threats that had sent him to California. It was simply understood that this chapter was closed, that Isabella's past had been surgically removed from her present, and that the cost of this service was her continued presence in Matteo's carefully controlled world. The gala was Friday night, and on Wednesday afternoon, Rosa took Isabella to the boutique Matteo had mentioned, a place on Fifth Avenue with no visible pricing, and a sales staff who treated them like visiting royalty the moment Rosa mentioned Mr. Romano's name. Isabella tried on dress after dress, each more expensive than anything she had ever worn, and finally settled on something in deep emerald green that made her skin glow and her figure look like something out of a Renaissance painting. "He'll like this one," Rosa said with knowing approval, and Isabella pretended not to understand the implications, pretended she was choosing a dress for professional reasons rather than because she wanted to see Matteo's reaction when he saw her wearing something beautiful for the first time. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth, and Isabella spent the afternoon at a salon Rosa had arranged, emerging with hair that fell in soft waves and makeup that enhanced rather than masked. She dressed in her apartment, standing in front of her mirror and barely recognizing the woman looking back, elegant and polished, and nothing like the girl who used to hide bruises under oversized coats. A car arrived at 6:30, black and sleek, with a driver who held the door and called her Miss Torres, and she was driven to the mansion where the gala was being held in the ballroom she had never seen but had heard was spectacular. Matteo met her at the entrance, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, just stood there looking at each other with an intensity that made the air feel charged. He wore a tuxedo that fit him like it had been painted on, his hair perfectly styled, his tattoos hidden beneath expensive fabric except for the hint of ink at his collar and the backs of his hands. He looked dangerous and refined simultaneously, a predator in gentleman's clothing, and when his eyes traveled slowly from her face, down her body and back up again, Isabella felt heat flood her skin. "You're beautiful," he said quietly, and it wasn't a compliment so much as an observation, a statement of fact that somehow meant more than poetry would have. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. He offered his arm and she took it, and they walked into the ballroom together, into a world of crystal chandeliers and champagne, and people who looked at Matteo with a mixture of respect and fear, and looked at Isabella with barely concealed curiosity. She recognized some faces from news reports, from magazines, from the kind of gossip that circulated about New York's social elite and its criminal underbelly that often overlapped in ways people pretended not to notice. Matteo introduced her as his personal assistant, and she smiled and shook hands and made polite conversation, all while acutely aware of his hand at the small of her back, possessive and warm through the thin fabric of her dress. They moved through the crowd like dancers who had been practicing together for years, his attention always half on her even when speaking to others, her awareness of him a constant presence that made everything else feel slightly unreal. They were talking to a city councilman and his wife when Isabella saw her. Across the ballroom, standing near the bar with a champagne flute and a predatory smile, was a woman who was looking at Matteo with the kind of familiarity that spoke of history. She was stunning, blonde and tall, and wearing a dress that probably cost more than Isabella's monthly rent. And when she saw Isabella notice her smile widened into something sharp. "Excuse me," the woman said to whoever she had been talking to, and walked directly toward them, her heels clicking on marble floor with the rhythm of inevitability. Isabella felt Matteo tense slightly, felt his hand press more firmly against her back, and knew without being told that this was about to become complicated. "Matteo," the woman said, her voice honey-smooth with an edge of steel. "It's been too long." "Sophia," he replied, his tone neutral, carefully polite. "I didn't realize you were on the guest list. Daddy made a generous donation. You know how it is." Sophia's eyes slid to Isabella, assessing and dismissive in a single glance. "And who is this? Another assistant? You do go through them quickly." "Isabella Torres," Matteo said before Isabella could introduce herself. "And she's far more than just an assistant. Isabella, this is Sofia Marchetti. Her father and I have some business connections." The way he said it made it clear that business connections was a euphemism for something darker, and Sofia's smile suggested she knew exactly what he meant. "How nice for you both. Though I have to say, Matteo, I'm surprised to see you bring a date to these things. You usually prefer to come alone. Less complicated that way, isn't it?" There was history here, Isabella realized, watching the way Sofia looked at Matteo with barely concealed anger mixed with want, watching the way Matteo maintained his careful neutrality while subtly positioning himself between Isabella and the other woman. They had been lovers, or almost lovers, or something complicated that had ended badly and left Sofia with the kind of resentment that fermented into vindictiveness. "I'm expanding my preferences," Matteo said smoothly. "Change is healthy." "Or it's a weakness," Sofia countered, her eyes flicking back to Isabella. "Pretty thing like you, working for a man like Matteo Romano. I hope you know what you're getting into. He's very good at making women feel special right up until he decides they're not useful anymore. Ask me how I know." Isabella felt Matteo's hand tighten on her back, felt him preparing to respond, to defend her or dismiss Sofia or possibly both. But something inside her snapped. She was tired of being talked about like she wasn't there. Tired of being treated like a helpless thing that needed constant protection. Tired of other people defining her value based on their assumptions about her capabilities. "Actually," Isabella said, her voice clear and cold, "I'm quite aware of what I'm getting into, Miss Marchetti, and unlike some people, I have no interest in discussing my employer's personal life at a charity gala. Now, if you'll excuse us, we were in the middle of a conversation with the councilman about his education initiative." Sofia's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her perfect features, and Isabella felt a surge of satisfaction at having caught her off guard. Matteo's hand remained at her back, but now there was something different in his touch. Something that felt like approval or respect, or maybe just dark amusement at watching his current interest put his former one in her place. "How refreshing," Sofia said, her voice sharp now, pretense of friendliness abandoned. "She has claws. Do be careful, Matteo. The last time you got involved with someone who talked back, it ended rather messily. And by messily, I mean with her leaving the city in the middle of the night to escape whatever arrangement you'd decided she was part of." "That's enough," Matteo said, his voice dropping into a register that made several nearby conversations pause. "You can be bitter about how things ended between us, Sofia, but you don't get to take that bitterness out on someone who has nothing to do with our history. Isabella works for me. That's all you need to know. Now walk away before I remind your father exactly why our business connection remains profitable for him and precarious for you." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Isabella saw Sofia's face pale slightly before she recovered, lifting her chin in defiance that everyone present could see was mostly performance. "Still the same charming Matteo. I'm sure Miss Torres will enjoy discovering all your delightful qualities. Do give my regards to your father, won't you? I'm sure he'll be fascinated to hear you're dating the help." She turned and walked away, her departure marked by whispers that rippled through the nearby crowd. And Matteo let out a slow breath, his hand sliding from Isabella's back to her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a gesture that was both possessive and surprisingly gentle. "I apologize for that," he said quietly. "Sofia and I have a complicated history that I should have anticipated would cause issues tonight." "What happened between you?" Isabella asked, not sure she wanted to know, but unable to stop herself from asking. She wanted things I couldn't give her. Marriage, respectability, a version of me that didn't exist outside her imagination. When I made it clear that wasn't possible, she took it badly. Badly enough that her father had to intervene before she did something that would have required a more permanent solution. Isabella processed this, understanding that permanent solution was another euphemism, another reminder that the man whose hand she was holding was capable of violence that extended far beyond hospital stays and forced relocations. And the woman who left the city? The one she mentioned? Matteo was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. Someone I was involved with before Sophia. She decided she couldn't live with what my life required, and I let her go. Sophia is correct that it ended messily, but she's wrong about why. Elena left because I gave her the choice. I won't make that mistake again. The implication was clear, uncomfortable, and absolutely in character for a man who had already demonstrated that he didn't view Isabella's agency as particularly relevant to his decisions about her future. But before she could respond, before she could decide whether to be angry or afraid, or some complicated mixture of both, a man approached them, tall and silver-haired, and radiating the kind of authority that came from decades of power. "Romano," the man said, his voice carrying an Italian accent thicker than Matteo's. "I see you've brought a beautiful companion this evening. You'll have to introduce me." Matteo's entire demeanor changed, his posture becoming more formal, his expression carefully neutral in a way that signaled respect mixed with caution. "Don Marchetti, allow me to introduce Isabella Torres, my personal assistant. Isabella, this is Antonio Marchetti, Sophia's father and a valued business associate." Don Marchetti took Isabella's hand and brought it to his lips in a gesture that was old-fashioned and somehow menacing, his eyes sharp as he studied her face. "Enchanted. Though I must say, Romano, personal assistant seems like an insufficient description for someone who causes my daughter such visible distress. Perhaps we should discuss the nature of this relationship over drinks sometime. I find myself curious about your recent decisions." It wasn't a request, and the threat beneath the polite words was barely concealed. Matteo's hand tightened on Isabella's, a silent communication she couldn't quite decode. And when he spoke, his voice was perfectly controlled, perfectly respectful, and somehow absolutely final. "With respect, Don Marchetti, my personal life is precisely that. Personal. Isabella's position in my household is not open for discussion or interpretation. I hope that's clear." The older man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Crystal clear, my boy. Though I hope you understand, that clarity sometimes comes at a cost. Sophia is my daughter, and her happiness matters to me. When someone injures her pride, it reflects on our family. I trust you remember how we handle matters of family honor." "I remember," Matteo said quietly. "Just as I'm sure you remember that my family handles matters of honor with equal commitment. I have no desire for conflict with you, but I won't be dictated to regarding who I choose to spend my time with. Isabella is under my protection. That should be sufficient explanation for everyone, including your daughter." The two men stared at each other for a long moment, and Isabella felt the weight of history and violence and complicated alliances pressing down on the conversation, felt herself being discussed and defended like a piece of property whose value was being negotiated. Part of her wanted to interrupt, to remind them both that she was standing right there, that she was a person rather than a symbol of someone's pride or someone else's protection. But she stayed quiet, understanding instinctively that this wasn't about her at all, but about power and respect and the invisible lines that men like this drew around their territories. Finally, Don Marchetti nodded, the gesture slight but meaningful. "Your protection. Yes, I suppose that does clarify matters. I'll speak with Sophia, help her understand that some battles aren't worth fighting. But Romano, do remember that protection is a responsibility that extends beyond keeping someone safe. It also means ensuring they don't become liabilities. I trust Miss Torres understands the importance of discretion." "She does," Matteo said, not looking at Isabella, keeping his attention fixed on the older man. "You have my word on that." "Good. Then we have no problem." Don Marchetti smiled again, warmer this time, and clapped Matteo on the shoulder with false joviality. Enjoy your evening, and Miss Torres, welcome to our world. I hope you find it everything you've been looking for." He walked away, leaving them standing in the middle of the ballroom with a dozen pairs of eyes watching, and Isabella finally allowed herself to breathe, to process what had just happened, to understand that she had just been publicly claimed by Matteo Romano in a way that made her simultaneously safer and more trapped than she had ever been. "We should leave," Matteo said quietly, already guiding her toward the exit. That conversation was a courtesy, not a negotiation. "Marchetti will expect me to reinforce the point privately, and I'd rather do that without you present." Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to ask what reinforce the point meant, wanted to understand exactly what she had just become part of. But Matteo was already moving them through the crowd, already signaling to someone she didn't see, already orchestrating their exit with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The car was waiting when they reached the entrance, and he helped her inside with the careful attention he had shown all evening, then slid in beside her and told the driver to take them back to the mansion. They rode in silence, the city lights passing outside the windows like stars falling in slow motion, and Isabella sat there in her emerald dress, feeling like she had just crossed some invisible threshold that she couldn't uncross, that accepting Matteo's protection at a public event in front of people who understood exactly what that meant had changed her status in ways she was only beginning to comprehend. When they arrived at the mansion, Matteo walked her to her car, and she expected him to say goodnight, to let her leave, to return to whatever business required his attention. But instead, he stood there in the driveway, with his jacket unbuttoned, and his tie loosened, and his eyes darker than the night sky, looking at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve. "I shouldn't have brought you tonight," he said finally. "I knew Sophia would be there, knew her father would make implications, knew that showing up with you would create exactly the kind of situation that puts you in danger. But I wanted you there anyway. Wanted to see you in that dress. Wanted everyone in that room to understand that you're mine to protect now, regardless of what complications that creates. That was selfish, and I apologize." Isabella didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to an apology that wasn't really an apology, but rather an admission that he would make the same choice again, regardless of the consequences. "You told Don Marchetti I'm under your protection. What does that mean exactly?" "It means that anyone who hurts you answers to me. It means that you're part of my world now, whether you want to be or not, and that comes with both safety and danger. It means that Sophia and her father and everyone else who was in that ballroom tonight knows that touching you is the same as declaring war on me." He stepped closer, and Isabella had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, had to resist the urge to step back, because stepping back would feel like retreat, and she was tired of retreating. "It means that you're mine, Isabella. Not as property, not as possession, but as responsibility, as someone I've decided is worth the complications, as someone I won't let go of, because letting go would mean admitting I was wrong about you being worth protecting, and I'm never wrong about these things." "That's not romantic," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "That's terrifying." "Yes," he agreed. "It is. And you're still here, still standing in my driveway at midnight, in a dress I bought you, still looking at me like you can't decide whether to kiss me or run from me, because some part of you understands that terrifying and romantic aren't opposites, that the kind of intensity I offer is exactly what you've been craving, even if you didn't know it until now." He was right, and she hated that he was right, hated that standing there in the darkness with this dangerous man who had orchestrated violence on her behalf and publicly claimed her in front of people who understood exactly what that meant. She wanted nothing more than to close the distance between them and find out what his mouth tasted like, what it would feel like to stop resisting the inevitability of this situation and just surrender to whatever was building between them. But she didn't kiss him, didn't close that distance, because kissing Matteo Romano would mean admitting that she was exactly the kind of person who fell for dangerous men, who mistook protection for love who would accept possession as long as it came wrapped in expensive dresses and gentle touches and the promise that someone finally saw her. "I should go home," she said instead. "You should," he agreed, but he didn't move, didn't step back, just continued to look at her with those dark eyes that promised things she shouldn't want. "Good night, Mr. Romano." "Matteo," he corrected softly. "When it's just us, you call me Matteo. Mr. Romano is for business hours and public settings. Right now, it's just you and me, and the truth we're both dancing around. Good night, Matteo." "Good night, Isabella. Drive carefully. Text me when you get home so I know you arrived safely." She got in her car and drove away, watching him in the rearview mirror until he disappeared into the darkness. And only when she was alone on the highway did she allow herself to process everything that had happened. Everything that was happening. Everything that was inevitably going to happen, whether she wanted it to or not. Isabella texted him when she got home. Just 3 words. "Home safe. Thanks." And his response came immediately. "Good. Sleep well. We'll talk tomorrow." Which felt less like a courtesy, and more like a promise, or possibly a threat. And Isabella fell asleep that night with her phone on the pillow beside her, half hoping and half dreading that it would ring again, that Matteo would call and say something that would make this situation either better or worse, but at least more clearly defined. But he didn't call. And in the silence of her apartment, Isabella lay awake and wondered exactly when she had stopped wanting to run from the monster in her story and started wanting to understand him instead. Saturday morning arrived with rain, gray and steady, and Isabella woke to find a text from Matteo sent at 6 a.m. "Don't come in today. Take the weekend. You've earned it." Simple, direct, and completely at odds with what she had expected, which was demands for her time or explanations about last night, or something that would require her immediate presence and attention. Instead, he was giving her space, which somehow felt more unsettling than if he had insisted she come to the mansion. She spent the day cleaning her apartment, doing laundry, running errands, trying to establish normalcy in a life that had become anything but. By evening, she was restless, unable to settle, unable to stop thinking about Matteo's expression in the driveway, about Sophia's bitter words, about Don Marchetti's veiled threats. She ordered takeout and turned on the television, searching for distraction, and found it in the form of a news report that made her blood run cold. Sophia Marchetti, daughter of prominent businessman Antonio Marchetti, was hospitalized this evening after what police are calling an attempted mugging gone wrong. Miss Marchetti was found in her vehicle on a remote stretch of road with significant injuries. She is currently in stable condition. Police are investigating but have few leads at this time. Isabella stared at the screen, her dinner forgotten, her mind racing. Sophia had confronted Matteo at the gala, had insulted Isabella, had made implications about his past that had clearly angered him. And now, less than 24 hours later, she was in the hospital with injuries that police were calling an attempted mugging, despite the fact that everyone who had been at that gala would know exactly what this actually was. This was Matteo reinforcing the point. This was him making clear that insulting his personal assistant, questioning his choices, bringing up his past relationships in public was unacceptable and would be met with consequences. This was him protecting her in the most brutal way possible, demonstrating to everyone in their world that Isabella Torres was not to be threatened or undermined, or treated with anything less than the respect due to someone under Matteo Romano's protection. And Isabella sat there in her apartment, takeout growing cold, feeling a complicated mixture of horror and satisfaction that made her question everything she thought she knew about herself, because part of her was horrified that Matteo had hurt Sophia, that he had responded to verbal insults with physical violence, that his solution to problems was always force rather than negotiation. But another part, a darker part she hadn't known existed, was satisfied, was glad that Sophia had been taught a lesson, was grateful that Matteo had defended her so absolutely that no one would dare question her position again. that was the part that terrified her most. Not Matteo's violence, but her own acceptance of it. Her own gratitude for it. The realization that she was exactly the kind of person who could fall in love with a monster as long as that monster was on her side. Her phone rang, and she knew before looking that it would be Matteo. She answered on the third ring, her voice carefully neutral. "Hello. Have you seen the news?" he asked without preamble. "Yes. And I understand what you did, what you're doing, the point you're making." There was a long silence on his end, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost tentative. "Are you afraid of me now?" Isabella thought about lying. Thought about saying yes, of course she was afraid. Anyone with sense would be afraid of a man who put people in hospitals for verbal slights. But she was tired of lying, tired of pretending to be someone she wasn't, tired of performing the right emotions instead of feeling her actual ones. "No," she said quietly. "I'm afraid of how not afraid I am. I'm afraid that I looked at that news report and felt relieved instead of horrified. I'm afraid that I'm becoming someone who accepts violence as protection and calls it love." "I never said I loved you," Matteo said, and somehow that hurt more than anything else he could have said. "I know, but you're grooming me to accept it when you do. You're teaching me to be grateful for your brutality. You're conditioning me to see possession as care. And the worst part is that it's working, Matteo. It's working and I don't know how to stop it or even if I want to." Another long silence, and Isabella could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. Could imagine him in his office or his bedroom or wherever he was, processing her words, deciding how to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw in a way she had never heard before. "I can't promise you normal, Isabella. I can't promise you safe or healthy or anything that looks like what you probably deserve. What I can promise is that no one will ever hurt you again. That you'll never have to hide bruises or make excuses or feel invisible. That I will see you every single day for the rest of your life and never stop seeing you. Is that enough? Because if it's not, you need to tell me now. Before this goes any further. Before I make you mine in ways that can't be undone." "What if I'm not enough for you?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been lurking beneath everything else. "What if you get bored, or decide I'm a liability like Elena was? What happens to me then?" "Elena left because I gave her the choice. I won't make that mistake with you." "So I'm a prisoner?" "No, you're mine. There's a difference. Prisoners want to escape. You don't want to escape, Isabella. You want to surrender. You want someone to take the burden of choice away from you and just tell you where you belong. And I'm telling you, you belong here. With me. In this complicated, dangerous, absolutely fucked up situation that we're creating together. The only question is whether you're brave enough to admit that's what you want." He was right. God help her, he was right. She didn't want to run. Didn't want to escape. Wanted exactly what he was offering. Which was the dangerous kind of certainty that came from complete surrender to someone else's will. Wanted to stop fighting, stop resisting, stop pretending that she was strong enough to navigate her life alone, when alone had gotten her nothing but Marcus's fists and minimum wage and invisibility that felt like slow suffocation. "I want it," she whispered into the phone, the admission feeling like jumping off a cliff, like free fall, like the moment before impact when you can't tell if you're flying or falling. "I want everything you're offering, even the parts that terrify me. Especially the parts that terrify me. Because at least with you, I know exactly what the danger is. At least with you, I'm not invisible." "Then it's done," he said, his voice rough with something that might have been triumph or relief or possession. "You're mine now, Isabella. Mine to protect. Mine to keep. Mine to love when you're finally ready to hear it. And anyone who threatens that, anyone who tries to take you from me or hurt you, or make you doubt that you made the right choice, will learn exactly what I'm capable of when something I value is at risk. What about Sophia? She asked, needing to know how far this went, how much violence he was willing to commit in her name. Sophia will recover, and she'll never speak to you or about you, or even think your name too loudly again. Don Marchetti understands now what I meant by protection. Everyone who was at that gala understands. You are mine, Isabella, and I mark what's mine in ways that make sure everyone knows not to touch. That's not normal, she said, but without conviction, without the moral high ground she should have been claiming. No, he agreed. It's not, but you don't want normal. If you wanted normal, you would have run the moment Marcus ended up in the hospital. You would have quit the job when I promoted you. You would have refused to attend the gala. But you didn't do any of those things, because normal is what got you bruises and invisibility, and a life spent making yourself smaller for other people's comfort. I'm offering you the opposite of normal. The question you need to answer is whether that's enough. Isabella looked around her small apartment, at the life she had built from safety and invisibility and careful smallness, looked at the future Matteo was offering, dangerous and intense and absolutely overwhelming, looked at the choice she was being given, which wasn't really a choice at all, because she had already made it the moment she accepted his promotion, the moment she wore his dress to his gala, the moment she stood in his driveway and didn't run when he told her she was his. It's enough, she said, and heard him release a breath he had been holding. Then come here. Now. Tonight. Pack a bag and come to the mansion. I want you here, Isabella. Want to see you. Want to have this conversation face to face instead of through a phone. Can you do that for me? She should say no. Should maintain boundaries. Should insist on space and time and the ability to process this enormous decision she was making. But Isabella found herself standing, found herself walking to her bedroom and pulling a bag from the closet, found herself packing like someone running toward danger instead of away from it. I'm coming, she said, and ended the call before she could change her mind. The drive to the mansion took 20 minutes, and every mile felt like she was crossing into different territory, leaving behind the person she had been, and becoming someone new. Someone who accepted protection that came with brutality, who valued being seen more than being safe, who had decided that surrendering to Matteo Romano's obsessive attention was better than the alternative of invisibility. The gates opened before she arrived, as if he had been watching for her, and she parked in the circular driveway and walked to the front entrance where Matteo was waiting, still dressed in the casual clothes he must have been wearing when they talked, his shirt untucked and his feet bare and his expression unguarded, in a way she had never seen before. She dropped her bag on the steps and walked straight to him, and he caught her, his arms wrapping around her as if she were something precious and fragile and desperately needed. They stood there in the doorway, holding each other, and Isabella felt something inside her finally relax, finally stop fighting, finally accept that this was where she belonged, in the arms of a man who would destroy anyone who threatened her and call it love. Welcome home, he said against her hair, and she realized with sudden clarity that this was exactly what she had been searching for her entire life. This sense of being claimed and kept and valued so absolutely that the cost didn't matter, that the violence and possession and dangerous intensity were simply the price of finally being seen. The news the next morning reported that Marcus Vega had been found dead in California, an apparent suicide, though the details were vague and the timing suspicious to anyone paying attention. Isabella read the article while drinking coffee in Matteo's kitchen, sitting at the breakfast table where staff would soon begin their day, and felt nothing. No grief, no guilt. Just a distant acknowledgement that the past was truly closed now, that the man who had hurt her was gone, that Matteo had made sure of it in the most permanent way possible. She looked up to find him watching her from the doorway, his expression neutral, but his eyes assessing, waiting to see how she would react to this final piece of information, this ultimate proof of how far he would go to protect what he had decided was his. He would have come back, Matteo said quietly. Eventually, he would have forgotten to be afraid and come back. I couldn't allow that risk. Not when you're mine to protect now. Isabella should have been horrified. Should have run. Should have called the police and reported everything she suspected. But instead, she set down the article, walked across the kitchen to where Matteo stood, and kissed him for the first time, pouring everything she felt into that kiss. Gratitude and fear and possession and the dark satisfaction of knowing that she would never have to be invisible again. Never have to hide bruises. Never have to make herself small because the monster in her story had decided she was worth protecting. And nothing would ever hurt her again. When they finally broke apart, Matteo looked at her with dark eyes that promised more than protection, more than possession, promised a future that would be complicated and dangerous, and absolutely overwhelming, and exactly what she had chosen. "I love you," he said, the words simple and devastating and true. "I've loved you since the moment I saw those bruises and decided you were mine. Everything I've done, everything I will do, comes from that. Do you understand?" "Yes," Isabella said, because she did understand, because she had crossed the threshold now and there was no going back, because she had looked at the monster in her story and decided to stand beside him instead of running away. "I understand, and I love you too. God help me, I love you too." They stood there in the kitchen as morning light filled the mansion, as Rosa arrived and politely pretended not to see them, as the machinery of Matteo's empire began its daily operation around them. And Isabella understood with absolute clarity that this was her life now, that she had traded invisibility for obsession, safety for danger, autonomy for the terrifying certainty of being claimed by someone who would burn the world down to keep her safe. And she had never been happier. The end.